So how did you start working in motorsport, and sort of what exactly do you do?
How I got started was, I guess, when I was finishing up uni, finishing up my postgrad degree, I kind of made the decision of there's nothing that I can see that I really want to do aside from this kind of like general idea of I really like motorsport as a fan, and can I try and find a job that's somewhat related to what I've studied that I can work in. So my I did a degree in a Bachelor of Commerce, which is I guess like the Australian equivalent of like a BBA. Um, so just like a general business degree essentially, and majored in marketing. The way that I kind of got into it, so at the time, social media was only just kind of starting to creep into motorsport. Like some teams had a social media presence, but like Formula One themselves, like they didn't even have an Instagram at this stage. So it was social was really in its infancy in terms of being sort of like a big part of the sport. So I originally thought I'll see if I can go down like a traditional comms route. So I started writing a blog about the sport, and essentially just showing that I can write in like a engaging but professional manner, and hopefully a team will or an organization will pay attention to me and what I'm writing, and maybe they'll bring me on in some capacity. So that sort of happened in a way. I ended up getting an internship with Lotus F1 team, which are now present day Alpine F1 team. So I went in with them to just have a meeting, and it came out with an internship, which was as part of their press team. So I was helping out writing the web stories based on their press release over race weekends. During the summer shutdown of that year, which was 2014, they were one of the teams that were actually really forward thinking in their social presence. So I helped out with the team in creating like a summer activation on their social channels. But it was that sort of experience and internship which got me on the radar for my first actual paying job in F1, which was the social media lead for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, essentially. So they kind of they saw that I had social experience as well as F1 experience, and I think promoter side again, they were one of the sort of first promoters to really think like social media is such a strong platform for us and such a way for us to engage with the fans of the sport, and hopefully in their case convert fans of the sports into ticket holders for their race. So yeah, that's kind of like in a nutshell how I kind of got into it, from the idea of I'd like to work in this to the journey to the first role. It was I mean, it's very condensed. That happened over the course of like a year and a half, but yeah.
Yeah, and do you think maybe like social media has played a role in maybe making fans feel more involved in the actual sport? Because obviously it's a sport that does obviously involve quite a lot of money, and sometimes people can't actually attend it. So do you think maybe having that access with like maybe social media admin and stuff like that has made fans feel more involved?
Oh, definitely, 100%. I think as well, the sport as a whole, so like Formula One themselves, have really recognised that in the past few years. Just for myself, for being promoter side, so I ended up being with the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix for 4 years, from 2015 right through to the start of 2019, and just the way that our access evolved in those few years was like looking from 2015 to 2019, it was like chalk and cheese.
Yeah.
With like it really evolved in a way that they saw social media as not a threat to broadcast views anymore. It wasn't a, well, people should be paying for this. It was a way of showcasing, look how amazing this sport is, and look how like incredible the behind the scenes aspects are, and whatever you wanted to show, you could show essentially in social media. So yeah, they really started to see it as a way to really engage fans, and bring them closer to the sport, rather than kind of having that like traditional barrier that had been there for so many years.
Yeah. And do you feel like, have you always been a motorsport fan? Is that something that you've always been interested in? Or is it something like, oh, I got a job here, so now I'm like more into it? Or what was that like?
Um, it's kind of a funny one, because if I try and pinpoint where I became a motorsport fan, like this, it's really hard to kind of have this like, ah, yes, that was the moment. Like I definitely wasn't like an F1 fan from birth. It was kind of, I liked, I remember it when I was really, really young, when I was like sort of 5 or 6 years old, and sort of I had this vague memory of what F1 was because it used to race in the city that I lived in, and I lived really close to where it used to race. And I had this kind of vague memory of that, and this also like memory of it being a game, because the first like proper memory I have of it is like the PlayStation game in '97, which my parents gave to my brother for Christmas, and playing that with him and playing the Monaco Grand Prix circuit and having this memory of my dad being like, oh, that's a real race and it's here, and like showing us on a map where Monaco was. And I just remember thinking, that's crazy. This is a game. It can't be real. But you know, that kind of like, not that I was massively into like racing games, but I had this like interest in racing for that perspective. But I didn't think of it really as a sport probably until when I was maybe like 19 or so. And then I actually started watching races again, and watching them sort of properly and actually following the storylines and following the season. And so it kind of then emerged around then. But there was this always kind of like, I don't see it as a way that I wouldn't have gotten into the sport, because I just don't see anything else that I was that interested in. And from a working perspective, like I can't imagine myself working anywhere else, to be honest.
Yeah, so would you say this is something that you sort of want to do for like maybe the next like what 10 years? You still see yourself working in Formula One and motorsport?
To be honest, I think I see it as my entire career working in motorsport. If I am lucky enough to still be working in the sport in 10 years' time, like that will be amazing for me. But yeah, I mean, there were a couple of times sort of early on in my career where maybe towards the end of the season I think, oh god, like this is tiring, and like you massively give up your social life as well working in motorsport, because obviously racing happens on weekends. But like there would be a time maybe like towards the end of the season, like once a year early on, that I'd think, oh, maybe I could do like this, but not in motorsport. Maybe I'll look at doing it something else, and I'd sort of just have a look around, and literally nothing would appeal to me. And then as the season would start to sort of kick into gear again, as soon as it would start, I'd go, oh my God, like, no, I can't walk away from this. This is amazing.
Yeah. And so like for you, what exactly is it that you do? So like say from the outside looking in, you sort of have an opinion, but like from you, what exactly do you do in motorsport?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the easiest way to kind of put it into like a job title or describe it is I'm like a social media manager. So I've been a social media manager, promoter side with the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. I've been in F1 doing it for the F1 Paddock Club, and I've also been doing it for some other motorsport brands, but I'm about to transition into being a social media manager for a team. So that's quite exciting. But in 2020, I did make a bit of a deviation of that role and move into a little bit more of just content production. So working in social, you always kind of dabble in content production, or the roles I have always dabbled in content production, because we work with a team to film what we want to go on the social channels. But I've always tried to be as involved as I can in shaping what that content should be, and making sure that if it's going to be living on a digital channel, that it's, you know, it's social first and it has all of these best practices in, so that it's not just a piece of content for content's sake, basically. But yeah, 2020 had a bit of a deviation, because that content was, instead of it being like a post production piece that would live on social media, it was a completely live
Yeah.
piece. So it was a different type of production, but still really fun to do. Really
Yeah,
good.
and just sort of like talking about 2020, how was that for you? Because were you in Australia when everything went down, or was that like, yeah, so so what was that like for you? Just like obviously it was probably one of the first major sporting events to actually, you know, be shut down, because it was like all these massive groups of people and like all these fans just like all coming together. So obviously at some point it might have got shut down. So what was the
Yeah.
entire process like for you?
it was really looking back on it, it was just so bizarre because the atmosphere, the feeling kind of during the event. Um, on the first day that we were there, because I was there, I think we flew in on the Tuesday or the Wednesday. So like basically just in time for the Grand Prix. Um, we had shoots to do and film on the Thursday and sort of social to run on the Thursday, which felt normal. There was obviously talks of what the pandemic was. Inside the paddock, they had precautions in place, which at the time would sort of deem appropriate. So you were discouraged from sort of touching. There was basically encouraging of social distance, and they had hand sanitizer everywhere. And people were wearing masks, but it wasn't mandatory, and it was quite scattered. And then from the promoter side, the Australian Grand Prix promoter had made the decision to sort of cancel the autograph sessions in terms of like the meet and greet aspect of it. So fans weren't allowed to like touch people, but that was sort of as the whole social distancing aspect, and the fans themselves were also encouraged to social distance in grandstands and general public. So the Thursday kind of got off of just like, okay, it's happening, but you know, we've got some restrictions in place. Obviously Thursday night all of that changed, and it was like for our side, we were sort of told, well, a decision hasn't been made yet. There were certain protocols that we had to follow in terms of communication and messaging, which was sort of sent from the top down, just so that all the F1 brands had the same communications across the board. But we got to the track on Friday morning sort of thinking, okay, well, the rumor is it is going to be cancelled, but at the same time, we have to carry on as normal until that happens, because we also at this stage don't know if Bahrain is going to be cancelled or if it's just going to become a closed event. So it sort of was a bit of crisis mode, but also sort of like trying to plan around an ever-changing scenario. And then at about, I think it must have been maybe like 10 or 11 a.m., the final call came in of like, yeah, it's not going to happen. And obviously the press conference happened, but it was like, I've since described it as like a little bit apocalyptic, because like it was just, I've never seen a paddock so fully set up and so ready to go, but so silent. And especially on a Friday morning with everyone was there, but everyone was silent, because it was just kind of like, right, okay, what do we do? And then everyone was just listening to what the press conference was to kind of work out what the next steps were. So it was a really eye-opening experience to be and being like, wow, this is like a once in a lifetime thing. This is kind of crazy.
Yeah. And so coming off the back of that, how did you sort of feel like throughout those sort of couple months before July when the races did start back up? Like, what were you doing? Were you just sort of sat around? Because I think at that time when everyone was sort of just like sat at home with nothing to do, it was sort of like, are people going to bring out content for us to watch, or what are we actually going to do? So what was that like for you as well?
Yeah, so for me, it was actually really, it was a massive, I think for everyone as well, like it was quite a massive time of change and a bit of uncertainty and a bit of like, just want to get back to things. But I actually, in that time between Australia and going racing again in Austria, I actually changed roles. So I moved from the agency that I was at, which was quite a small agency contracted with F1, but they downsized very, very quickly from, we were a team of 6 at the time, and they downsized down to 2 people. So sort of immediately in the aftermath of the Australian Grand Prix, there was a bit of, as I say, like crisis management, restructuring of what our entire content plans were. And then about 2 weeks after the Grand Prix, it was just, right, okay, like we need to make you redundant, which was pretty scary as well, because it's, you know, at this stage, the very start of a pandemic, and you don't know how long it's going to be for. And obviously it wasn't what I had planned for the year. And I was like, oh my God, I've just lost my job in F1. This is like terrifying. But I was very lucky in that quite quickly I was then recontracted back with F1 to work on a very similar project, but still with the Paddock Club, but for their essentially their 2020 offering of the virtual paddock club. So it was uh, a shift essentially from working with an agency to just being a direct contractor, which then it kind of became a bit more like, okay, well, I have a plan now, so let's just see how this goes. But hopefully, it will become a permanent position at some point.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just, I mean, the way that it was structured at that point, it was just a trial in terms of they wanted me on for a project, which the project was only meant to be for the first 3 races, so for both Austrias and for Hungary. Yeah. And I was like, well, it's something, like it'll get me through. And yeah, it ended up being continued for the rest of the year, so that was lucky.
Yeah. And so what was it like being after such a long time? Like, what was that for you?
Sorry, say that again.
What was it like for you to be back in the paddock after such a long time away?
It was really, really bizarre, but also like this massive like weight off my shoulders, because like, especially in the way that I had changed roles, it was the kind of like that reassurance of like, it's okay, I'm going to be okay. And also being in Austria, it was my 3rd time in Austria, so it was so bizarre seeing it the way that it had been set up for the COVID restrictions. So like no motorhomes aside from the Red Bull motorhome that was already there. Like just so much like distance between everybody, mandatory masks. Obviously we knew that we had to get tested, and there was this real kind of like, everyone was sort of walking around being like, we don't want to be the one that accidentally brings down the entire paddock. So like super precautious for that first like race back. But yeah, like for me personally, it was just this massive feeling of relief of just like, okay, like I'm back, like we're doing okay, we're gonna do this, everything will be fine.
Yeah. Was there ever like that fear that maybe some would get COVID and then like everything would get shut down again, or was it always just like, okay, if this one person gets it, it's their bubble, but like sits out? Or what was it like?
Well, I think before someone actually came down with it, there was this massive, well, at least for me, it was always, you knew that there was the structure in place and all the separate bubbles, and the bubbles weren't allowed to mix, and you knew there were precautions in place to make sure that things, if the theory was if someone goes down, it's just their little team.
Yeah.
But also the way that my bubble was working, it was a bubble of 2. It was myself and my colleague and friend Sam. So we were kind of like, if one of us goes down, then we both go down, and we're the only 2 people on ground doing this show, essentially. So we really can't do it, because then we've ruined a partnership here, like for F1 and for Zoom. So we were really like, we can't get it. So we were quite paranoid
at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. But then obviously when there were a few positive cases that came through, I think in Hungary there was someone in their pre-event test, so we had to get tested before we could even travel to the track. So I think someone in their pre-event test came back inconclusive, and they just went, "Nah, you're not coming." So we were like, "Okay, well they're being strict with it." And then I think the first like big name, obviously, to all known name to test positive was Checo at Silverstone, and the fact that their race obviously went on, it was like, okay, well, Checo's isolating, his immediate bubble are isolating, and everyone else is still here. So the theory and the structure seems to be working. So okay, just don't bring down your bubble.
Yeah, and the rest of the season went on fine. So, well, I mean, obviously, other than a few positive cases, so that's good. Do you think that it's going to be like quite similar to that this year, coming into like Bahrain and the rest of the season?
I think definitely until summer, I can see this being a very similar season to 2020. Obviously, things change sort of all the time, but my personal opinion is, at least for the first few races, I know for Bahrain it will be the same. It'll just feel exactly the same as 2020. because I've got sort of friends and colleagues who are already in testing, and it's the same thing. It like the testing location is even in the same spot with the same sort of doctors and nurses. So I think it'll be a very similar season, but I'm hoping that towards the back end of the season we'll sort of start to see some return to normality.
Yeah.
Obviously, being able to attend and just a bit less restricted, but still with the cautions in place would be a good sort of happy medium.
Yeah, that'd be good. So obviously this is something that I really want to talk about. It's sort of just like being a woman in the field. It's such a male dominated field, you know, like motorsport as a whole, when you've got like no drivers, female drivers on the grid or anything like that. Do you think that there's a way to maybe make the sport more inclusive? And how do you feel as a woman in the sport, like working in the sport?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one because it's obviously been spoken about a fair bit recently with International Women's Day having just happened. But I think for me, I've been lucky enough that when I've been working, there have been very few times that I've kind of remembered that I am a woman, which I think is, to be fair, one of the best scenarios that you can be in, just being treated as a person. So if you have a good idea, it's treated as a good idea. If you have a bad idea, it's given feedback on, and you move on from that. There's probably been a handful of scenarios where it's sort of been uh, brought to my attention the gender that I am, or just having to be like, no, like it's me you're speaking to. Like one of which, like nothing major, but just I remember back when I was promoter side meeting with it was part of sort of like a larger media in meeting to determine just some ad space in a magazine. And I was the lead of the motorsport account. So I was in a room with two of my male colleagues, and the person who was coming in to meet with us kept speaking to my male colleagues, and they repeatedly said, like, we know nothing about motorsport. You need to talk to her. Like, it's her decision. And it took quite a while for the guy to eventually like address me properly because he was just so shocked that I was the person who knew about motorsport. But you know, luckily that's kind of been. I mean, that's the first instance that kind of, or the biggest instance that comes to mind in terms of like, okay, well, um, yeah, like you're a woman, but I think as a whole, I've noticed a bit more of a change in the last sort of few years. Like I've seen more women. Obviously, women have always been in the sport, but kind of in those traditional roles that you would almost, I mean, expect, you know, with quotation marks, expect women to be. And so, you know, you've always seen women in hospitality and in the marketing positions and marcoms positions, but more and more up and down the paddock, I've seen women on the pit wall, and I've seen women in the garages, and it's like, okay, yeah, this is good. And seeing like women making strategy calls or being engineers back in the factory, I've seen that change and noticed that change happening in the last few years, which is really refreshing to see.
Yeah.
And also just from when I moved from promoter side to working directly with F1, like I was so like in a good way, but I was shocked to see how many women there were in quite senior positions at F1.
Yeah.
And I was kind of like, wow, this is really cool. Like some of the top like lawyers and like directors in F1 were women, and I was like, this is insane. Like these women at powerhouses, and you would deal with them and meet with them, and you'd be like, oh my god, like I see exactly why they've got here, because they're just like forced to be reckoned with. But it was really kind of, it was refreshing, but also at the same time made me be like, right, you know, I can't. It was almost like I can't let the team down. I need to be like on my A game all the time.
Yeah. And did you sort of
Yeah.
feel this pressure that, okay, I'm coming into this as a woman? Did you ever feel this pressure like, oh, I need to know everything and I need to be perfect all the time, or else they're going to think maybe I'm not as good, or maybe I am just like a woman who doesn't know anything anyway?
Yeah, I think early on in my career, there was definitely a bit of that. So when I was transitioning sort of from fan to trying to work, I definitely felt the need that I needed to prove myself. Even just sort of in general conversation, if I'd be talking to someone and say like, "Oh, I like F1 and I would like to work in the sport," there were a few times where at this stage, I was still at my uni, and I remember quite distinctly one of my old lecturers who I saw like in the sort of staff room, because I was also doing postgrad. I was staff at uni as well, so you, yeah, that's relevant. I yeah, I remember having this conversation with this lecturer, and he brought up something. I mean, I'm born in 1990, so like even if I'm alive for a race in my early years, I'm not really going to remember it. But he brought up something from a race that happened in like the late 80s or the early 90s, kind of to prove his knowledge of F1 was better than mine or something. Like maybe not as aggressive as that, but that's kind of the way that I interpreted it at the time. But what I had been doing, unbeknownst to him, was I was watching all of the season reviews from 1980 all the way through to 2010, because I was just fascinated with those eras and with the stories that came through, and I wanted to see the drivers and the teams evolve into sort of what it was in present day. Like I just wanted to know all the backstories.
Yeah.
So I can't remember which particular race it was, but he brought up something to do with this race that happened like in the, yeah, as I said, the late 80s or the early 90s.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, actually that's not correct. And I replayed what happened in the race, corrected him, and he's like, well, you weren't alive then. I was like, yeah, but I still know it. Like, it's just, so there are a few instances back then that it felt like I needed to prove myself,
Yeah.
or at least, as I said to myself, like I needed to prove myself. But then the further I got into my career, it was maybe less that I needed to prove myself from a motorsport perspective, but maybe a bit more of if I was in a room where decisions were being made,
Yeah.
like I needed to make sure that what I was saying was said in the same way that maybe my male colleagues might have said it, because naturally they just seemed so kind of not set in their decision in a bad way, but they were so confident in their decision and their ability, and I was still second guessing myself and thinking, is this right? Or like I would, instead of phrasing something as a statement because I knew it should be that way, I would pose it as a question and then ask for others' opinions. So that took a little bit of kind of saying like, no, like you know what you're talking about, say it, and say it with conviction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like you see it a lot on social media, even like say you are part of like Twitter, or like, okay, yeah, I'm part of motorsport Twitter or football Twitter. It's like guys always have an opinion on a woman saying something. It's like, oh yeah, do you know what the offside rule is if a girl really likes football, or if it's like motorsport? Do you know what happened last year? It's like the girl can like sports without knowing every single thing that's ever occurred. Like you don't have to question their nobility to the sport and stuff, which is crazy. But yeah, how do you think in any way like do you think maybe there's like certain things that people can do to maybe make women feel more comfortable in the sport? Because I know a lot of people go into stuff like not feeling comfortable being a part of something because maybe it isn't, oh, I don't see someone who looks like me, or I don't see someone who is like me in it. So what would you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to remember what it was like when I first joined, because when I was really lucky, I think, in when I the team that I first joined into already naturally had a fairly good balance between men and women.
Yeah.
And then all day, I mean, I was in the UAE at the time, so it was also a mix of like loads of different nationalities as well. So I think I had probably the best possible introduction in terms of seeing people who looked like me. I mean, the only other Australian in the room was a male, but there was still times where we could connect because I was like, hey, I can mention a really niche Australian reference and you'll get it. But then at the same time, my direct reporting manager, client side, was a female. So at the same time, it was kind of like, right, well, I can see a woman in quite a powerful position, and then I can also see two other women in the same position as me, sort of in terms of hierarchy. So I was really lucky in terms of I could see some familiar faces. But in terms of, I guess, getting into any sort of role in motorsport now, if you don't see those familiar faces, I mean, the best thing I can say is at some point, and at some point soon, you probably will, because even if it's not in your immediate team, there will be women in other roles. If you're working in a team, there'll be women in other roles, factory side or once you get to a race weekend, there will be women there. And what I've found as well is women seem to we seem to, especially in motorsport, just come together and you have this instant sort of connection and relation. And you're like, okay, so it's sort of like this little unspoken bonds that you have with people, and it's just like you immediately want to share your story with each other and kind of make sure that that becomes someone that you can go to and rely on. And that's happened so much to me in the last sort of 2-3 years especially. There've been like so many different women who I've just met, even if it's just on Instagram, because you'll see who's at race weekends, you follow each other, and then you send a message, and now I've got so many friends based just on that. So you don't even have to meet someone physically for the first time, but there will be someone there that you can see who looks like you.
Yeah. Okay, so this is like the last section. So this is like interviewer side. So it's sort of like, what are your opinions on the upcoming season? Like, what do you think driver-wise? Who do you think might win the championship? Just like from your perspective, like, what do you think is going to happen this season?
Oh God, I never get asked these, so I always get to keep my opinion to myself. Really, like, personally, I would really like someone else to win the championship other than Lewis Hamilton, only for the fact that it would be like, oh my God, because he's just absolutely dominant. So it would be super exciting to see someone challenge him beyond the mid-season break, because that's when it seems to sort of go like, okay, no, Hamilton's going to win. Which, yeah, it would just, as a fan, it would just be so like, oh my God, like something different's happening. But I still think, I mean, the Mercedes car is just like, it's phenomenal. So I still, in the back of my mind, think it's going to be a Mercedes driver who wins the championship, most likely Lewis Hamilton. Personally, I would also really like to see kind of what happens with Alpine, because obviously Fernando Alonso's back in the team. So it's like, all right, well, are we going to see Alonso win a race or on the podium? Like, that's super exciting. Seb at Aston Martin, like he didn't get on with the sort of the recent Ferrari cars. He didn't find balance, really struggled, messed with his confidence. Like, is he just going to gel with the team and then be the Seb that we kind of knew from before the hybrid era? Like, I was I'm a massive Seb fan, so I would love to see him do really well. So the like predictions, like, I mean, yeah, predictions, as I said, I think Mercedes will still have the edge. Hopefully it's not a super similar season to 2020 in terms of the pecking order. But yeah, what I'd like if things mixed up a little bit. Hopefully Williams get their points as well, because they deserve some points.
Yeah, I feel like everybody wants something different, because like even just thinking back to like Monza last season where you saw new race winners is something really exciting. I think the fans loved that. So something new would be nice. But yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. Yeah.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great having you on. I think it's always really nice to hear from somebody who actually works in the sport, because I feel like you hear everything that the drivers have to say and stuff like that, and then you've got like your big journalists, but it's like nice to hear from somebody who actually works, in close range and stuff like that. So yeah, thank you so much.